This lecture is going over the culture of the High Middle Ages, specifically the rise of universities, how people in the Middle Ages learned, and a little bit on their literature. Just to let you know, the High Middle Ages, that refers to the later Middle Ages. The Middle Ages as it gets closer and closer to the Renaissance, which again is something you'll learn about next year. The word university comes from the Latin word universitas, and that word means guild. Now, you ought to remember guild from a couple lectures back. Remember, the guild was the group of workers, that would unite around sort of something that they produced. So you'd have the hat makers guild. These universities were guilds also, but they, instead of producing hats or shoes, they produced learning, right? They produced educated individuals. That was what they produced. So they started as like a guild, the guild of the educators and the educated, and then they grew up from there. The very, very first one is in Italy, and the first one in Northern Europe is in Paris. But shortly after that, some students from the Paris University go over to England, and they found Oxford. These are the very earliest universities, but by 1500 there are 80 of them. They're growing in popularity. And just to speak about some of the way a university would work, you see the picture on my left here. You would have the teacher who would lecture. Lecture also comes from a Latin word that means to read. And what they would do, they didn't have books for everybody because they didn't have the printing press yet. So the teacher had their book, had like the book, and the teacher would read to the students from the book. It would be as if I stood in front of the class and read to you from the textbook. The teacher would read from the book and also give their comments on the book. So they'd read the book, and then they'd also give what they thought about the book. And the students would, listen and absorb the information. Again, you see a picture of that over here to my left, and you see a picture of that to my right. And again, these university classes would be listening to the lecturer speak, and some amount of that time would literally just be them reading. And you didn't have a big choice about what you were going to study in the university, at least at the undergraduate level. You would study the 7 liberal arts, which are here. This is what they would teach you. They would teach you grammar, which hopefully you know what that is, right? That is the sort of proper putting together of language. You'd have rhetoric. Rhetoric is sort of what we do with our debates. Rhetoric would be, the practice of speaking effectively. Logic, literally, logic, being able to deduce things in the sort of very formal way of being able to deduce things. Arithmetic, that's math. They would teach you math and geometry, which is a branch of math. They knew those things. They could teach you those things. Music, should go without saying. They thought music was very important. And astronomy. Astronomy is the real one. Astronomy is the one where you study the stars and the planets and how they move. For these guys, they didn't know a lot of what we know. So these were, some of these were, young disciplines. Astronomy was something that was sort of coming into its own. These were the 7 liberal arts. These were the things that you would study at the first level. A big difference between education then and education now, a big difference between how these universities worked and how the universities that you go to will work, is that these guys didn't have any written exams. In medieval universities, students did not take written exams. You had one exam at the end of your courses, like when you were ready to graduate, and it was a spoken exam. So to graduate, a person would go before a committee of teachers. It's just like this picture here on my right. The guy whose back is to the camera is the student. They would talk to all the professors. So the teachers would quiz them, would ask them questions, and they'd have an oral examination where they demonstrated everything that they had learned. They would, go back and forth, again, verbally. And if they passed, then they would get their Bachelor of Arts. That was the first thing that you got. That was what you got if you passed the university. You could go on, just like in modern times, you could go on to earn your master's degree if you chose to do so. And again, it would be a similar kind of thing. You'd have to pass an oral examination to do that. Now, they did have doctorates as well. You could become a doctor at this time. They were available in only 3 categories. That was law. You could become a doctor of law and then go off and be a lawyer. You could become a doctor of medicine, doctors, same as today, or you could become a doctor of theology. Theology is the study of religion. You know, it's the branch of study where you study religion. And that was thought to be the most prestigious one. Of the 3 categories, that at the time was thought to be the highest status one that you could do. And once you got your doctorate, you could teach. Once you got your doctorate, you could go be one of the people, around the board that would be quizzing the other students. Or you could go do other things as well. The universities produced Europe's lawyers, Europe's doctors, and of course, Europe's teachers. When the Middle Ages begin, literature for the most part is written in Latin. Latin was the language of the ancient Romans, and it's a language that many or most educated people, highly educated people in Europe spoke, but it wasn't the daily language that people would speak to themselves. In the 12th century, before the 12th century, literature would be written in Latin pretty much all the time. In the 12th century, literature begins to appear that's written in the vernacular. Vernacular means the everyday language of a region, not the highfalutin, language, but the regular spoken language that people would speak to one another. So it begins to appear in French and Spanish, languages that the real people spoke. 2 different types of, literature that I want to point out to you. Troubadour poetry. Troubadours were like traveling musicians, and their poetry would often be, lovey-dovey, kind of stuff. And that was a very popular form of art, of music back then during this time. So we have some surviving examples of that. And again, it's flowery, very romantic type poetry. So if that's what you're into, you'd like the troubadour poetry. The heroic epics, like you have underneath me, those would typically be about, knights that went off to do courageous deeds, that went off to be great heroes and, slay bad guys. And that was like your ancient action movie. Was another very, very popular type of thing at this time. So you had your pick between whether you prefer, action movies or romantic comedies. You had your heroic epic was your action movie type thing, and your troubadour poetry, or your love poems. And this is what people in medieval times like to read.